The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine hallways of Central Space Academy as students hurried to their first classes. Among them, a figure stood out, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't help it. Lyra's blue skin seemed to shimmer under the fluorescent lights, her crystalline hair catching and reflecting rainbow patterns on the nearby lockers. She clutched her books tightly against her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. It wasn't working. The other students, humans, reptilians, and various other species from across the galaxy, stopped to stare as she passed. Some whispered behind their hands, others pointed openly, and a few even took steps back, as if her presence might somehow contaminate them. "Remember what Mother said," Lyra whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. "Just get through the day. Everything will be fine." But even as she repeated these words, she knew they weren't true. Nothing had been fine since her family had fled their dying world, seeking refuge in Earth's growing interstellar community. From his spot near the water fountain, Mike watched the new student navigate the hallway. He'd seen plenty of alien students before. Earth had been accepting refugees for the past decade, but something about this one was different. Maybe it was the way her hair seemed to chime softly as she walked, or how the patterns under her skin pulsed with a gentle blue light when she was nervous. The first class was interstellar biology, and as luck would have it, Lyra ended up seated right in front of Mike. He noticed how her shoulders tensed when the teacher called roll, how her voice trembled slightly when she answered present. The crystalline strands of her hair dimmed noticeably when several students snickered at her accent. "Now class," Mr. Wilson announced, "today we'll be discussing biological adaptations across different planetary environments. Would anyone like to share their species' unique features?" Several hands shot up, but Mike's attention was drawn to how Lyra seemed to sink lower in her seat. Her skin had darkened several shades, almost like a natural camouflage response. He'd never seen anything like it. The morning dragged on, and with each passing hour, Mike noticed more concerning behavior from his classmates. When Lyra tried to use her datapad in universal mathematics, someone whispered, "Bet she doesn't even know how to count in standard units." During physical education, no one would pair with her for anti-gravity exercises, leaving her to float alone in the corner of the gym. Lunch period proved to be the worst. The cafeteria was crowded with students from all grades, creating a cacophony of different languages and eating sounds. Lyra stood in line, her food tray shaking slightly in her hands. Mike watched as she approached several tables, only to be met with turned backs or suddenly reserved seats. Finally, she found an empty table in the corner, sitting with her back to the wall. As she ate, her hair crystals made soft, melancholic chiming sounds that reminded Mike of wind chimes on a sad day. He noticed how she took small, careful bites of her food, trying not to draw attention to the fact that her species absorbed nutrients through special glands in their cheeks rather than swallowing like most others. From his usual table with the hoverball team, Mike could see everything. He saw the way the popular girls from his grade walked past her table, making exaggerated gagging sounds. He noticed how even the other refugee students kept their distance, perhaps afraid that associating with her would make them targets too. As the day drew to a close, Mike watched Lyra pack up her things. Her movements were careful and measured, like someone trying to avoid making ripples in still water. The bright patterns that had decorated her skin that morning had faded to a dull pulse, barely visible now. She was the last to leave the classroom, waiting until everyone else had gone before making her way to the transport station. Mike stood at his locker, feeling an uncomfortable weight in his chest. He'd seen bullying before, but this was different. This wasn't just about being different. It was about being alone in a world that seemed determined to keep you that way. As he watched her disappear into the crowd of students heading home, he made a decision. Tomorrow would be different. The second week of school brought storm clouds, both literally and figuratively. Mike noticed the change as soon as he entered the academy's main hall. A group of students had gathered around Lyra's locker, and their laughter carried a mean edge that made his stomach twist. Tom, The star athlete from the anti-gravity racing team stood at the center of the group. His green scales gleamed under the hallway lights as he held something above his head, a crystal, similar to the ones in Lyra's hair. "Look what I found," he sneered, turning the crystal so it scattered light across the walls. "Guess she's falling apart already." Mike stopped at his locker, pretending to arrange his books while watching the scene unfold. He saw Lyra approach, her steps faltering when she spotted the group. The patterns under her skin flickered rapidly, like a distress signal. "Oh, look who's here," called out Rita, a human girl who always seemed to be wherever Tom was. "Our glowing friend. Hey, is this yours?" She pointed at the crystal Tom was holding. "You're leaving pieces of yourself all over the school. That's kind of gross, don't you think?" Lyra's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Please, that's part of my ceremonial crown. It's very important to my people." Her hands trembled as she reached for the crystal, but Tom held it higher. "Your people?" Tom laughed. "Aren't they the ones who couldn't even keep their own planet alive? Maybe if you spent less time growing pretty crystals and more time fixing things, you'd still have a home." The crowd grew silent. Even Rita looked uncomfortable at that comment. Lyra's skin had turned a deep, dark blue, almost black, and her hair crystals had stopped their usual gentle chiming completely. Mike felt his hands curl into fists. He watched as Lyra tried again to reach for her crystal, only to have Tom toss it to another student. They began a cruel game of keep-away, throwing the precious item back and forth while Lyra stood in the middle, turning helplessly from one to another. Finally, the crystal slipped through someone's fingers. It fell to the floor with a musical chime and shattered into tiny pieces. The sound it made was like breaking glass, but somehow sadder, as if the crystal itself was crying. Lyra dropped to her knees, carefully gathering the fragments. Nobody moved to help her. Some students walked away, others continued watching, but none stepped forward. Mike saw tears falling from her eyes. They glowed slightly, like liquid starlight. "Aw, is the alien girl crying?" Rita's voice had lost some of its earlier confidence, but she pressed on, perhaps feeling the need to maintain her social position. "Maybe you should go back to wherever you came from." "Oh wait, you can't." The bell rang, and the crowd began to disperse. Tom gave one last laugh before heading to class, kicking some of the crystal fragments as he walked away. Rita and her friends followed, their giggles echoing down the hall. Lyra stayed on the floor, gathering every tiny piece she could find. Mike watched as she opened a small pouch made of something that looked like woven starlight and carefully placed the broken fragments inside. Her movements were gentle, reverent, as if she was handling the remains of something once alive. When she finally stood up, Mike could see that her uniform was dusty from the floor. There were dark spots on her sleeves where her glowing tears had fallen. She opened her locker with shaking hands, put away the pouch, and took out her books. Throughout the morning classes, Mike noticed how Lyra seemed to have dimmed. The usual soft glow of her skin was barely visible, and her hair crystals hung limp and quiet. In universal mathematics, she didn't raise her hand once, even though Mike knew she knew the answers. He'd seen her solved equations in her notebook. During lunch, she didn't even try to find a table. Instead, she took her food tray to the library. Through the library's glass walls, Mike could see her sitting alone among the data crystals and holographic books, her food untouched as she held the pouch with her broken crystal. Something had to change, Mike decided. The question was, what could one human student do against a tide of cruelty that seemed to flow from every direction? The science fair was supposed to be the highlight of the semester at Central Space Academy. Students from all grades prepared projects showcasing their homeworld's technologies and cultures. The main hall buzzed with excitement as everyone set up their displays. Mike arrived early that morning, carrying his simple project about Earth's changing atmosphere. He spotted Lyra's display immediately. It was hard to miss. She had created a miniature version of her homeworld's crystal forests, complete with tiny glowing structures that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "It's beautiful," he heard other students whisper as they passed by. Even Tom and Rita stood at a distance, looking at it with something close to awe. The display showed crystalline trees reaching toward three moons, their branches creating natural music as they moved. Small holographic creatures darted between the crystal formations, and the whole thing glowed with soft, changing colors. During morning classes, Lyra seemed different. Her skin glowed a bit brighter, and her hair crystals chimed softly when she moved. For the first time since she'd arrived, she actually smiled while answering questions in interstellar biology. Mike realized this was the first time he'd seen her looking proud instead of afraid. But everything changed during lunch period. The crash echoed through the main hall like a thunderclap. Mike was heading back to class when he heard it, followed by the sound of breaking crystal and cruel laughter. He ran toward the noise, his heart already knowing what he would find. Lyra's project lay in ruins. The crystal structures were shattered, their soft glow fading like dying stars. The holographic projectors sparked uselessly, their delicate circuits crushed. Tom stood nearby, pretending to look shocked. "Oops," Rita said loudly, not even trying to hide her smirk. "Guess I tripped. These new anti-gravity shoes can be so hard to control." She made a show of adjusting her perfectly functioning shoes while her friends giggled. But Mike wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Lyra, who stood frozen, staring at the destruction of her work. Her skin had turned almost white, all color and glow completely gone. Her hair crystals made no sound at all, as if they too were in shock. Without a word, Lyra turned and ran. Mike saw her disappear down the hall toward the old science lab, the one nobody used anymore because the school had gotten newer equipment. This time, he didn't just stand and watch. He followed her. He found her in the darkened lab, sitting on the floor between old equipment cabinets. She was holding a piece of crystal from her ruined project, her tears falling onto it and making it glow briefly before fading again. "Go away," she whispered when she heard him approach. "Please, just go away." Instead, Mike sat down beside her. For a moment, they just sat in silence. Then Lyra spoke, her voice so quiet he had to lean closer to hear. "That project, it wasn't just about science," she said. "It was the last image I have of my home. My family managed to save one crystal seed before we had to leave. I grew those crystals myself, using the ancient methods my grandmother taught me." Her tears fell faster now, each one glowing like a tiny falling star. It took 3 months to grow them correctly. And now, she held out her hands where the broken pieces lay. Our world was dying. The crystal forests were the last to go. We tried everything to save them, but in the end, we could only save ourselves. She looked at Mike, her eyes glowing with tears. "We're not refugees because we wanted to be. We're refugees because we had no choice." Mike looked at the broken crystals, then at Lyra. In the dim light of the lab, with her natural glow dimmed by sadness, she looked so small and lost. But there was something else too, a strength in the way she carefully gathered every broken piece, in how she had tried to recreate something beautiful from her lost world. He made his decision then. No more watching from the sidelines. No more being just another silent face in the crowd. "I'm going to help you rebuild it," he said firmly. "And this time, nobody's going to break it. I promise." For the first time, Lyra looked directly at him, really seeing him. A tiny spot of color returned to her skin, a small glimmer of hope in the darkness. The cafeteria was packed when Mike walked in the next day. He spotted Tom and his friends at their usual table, laughing about something. Rita sat nearby, holding court with her usual group of followers. Lyra was in her corner, trying to eat quickly so she could leave. Mike took a deep breath. What he was about to do would change everything. He walked to the center of the cafeteria and climbed onto an empty table. The movement caught everyone's attention. It wasn't every day that one of the school's top athletes did something so unusual. "Hey," he called out, his voice carrying across the now quieting room. I need to say something, and I need everyone to listen. Tom snickered. Get down, man. What's wrong with you? What's wrong with me? Mike's voice grew stronger. What's wrong with all of us? Yesterday, I watched someone destroy months of hard work just because they could. I watched someone's memories of their home world get shattered, and nobody did anything. Nobody said a word. The cafeteria had gone completely silent now. Even the lunch robots had stopped their usual humming to listen. You all saw Lyra's project. It was beautiful. It showed us a world we'll never get to see because it's gone now. Mike pointed at Tom and his group. And you thought it was funny to destroy it. You think it's funny to hurt someone who's already lost everything. Rita stood up, her face flushed. It was an accident. No, Mike cut her off. It wasn't. And we all know it. You want to know what I learned yesterday? Lyra's people didn't come here because they wanted to. They came here because their world was dying. They tried to save it, and when they couldn't, they had to leave their homes behind. How many of us can even imagine what that feels like? He saw some students looking down at their tables, others glancing at Lyra, who sat frozen in her corner, her skin shifting through colors like an aurora. You know what else I learned? On her world, those crystals she grows, they're living things. They respond to emotions, to music, to life itself. That project wasn't just science. It was art, history, and memory all in one. And we stood by while it was destroyed. Mike jumped down from the table and walked over to Lyra's corner. But here's the thing. We humans have a long history of making mistakes. We've hurt people who were different, excluded them, made them feel unwelcome. But we also have a history of learning from those mistakes. He held out his hand to Lyra. After a moment's hesitation, she took it and stood up beside him. So here's what's going to happen. Mike continued, facing the cafeteria. We're going to rebuild Lyra's project. And this time, we're going to help her do it. Because that's what humans do. When we see something wrong, we fix it. When we hurt someone, we make it right. The silence in the cafeteria was deafening. Then, from somewhere in the back, a chair scraped. A tall student from the science club stood up. I'll help, they said. I got some spare holographic projectors in my locker. Another student raised their hand. My parents work with crystal growing. I bet they could give us some tips. One by one, students began offering help. Even some of Tom's friends broke away from his table to join the growing group around Mike and Lyra. Tom stood up, his face dark with anger. This is stupid. She's just N. Just what? Mike interrupted, his voice firm. Different. Lost. Alone. Maybe it's time you remembered that your grandparents were refugees too, Tom. They came here when their moon colony failed. Someone helped them then. Maybe it's time we did the same for someone else. The change in Tom's expression was subtle, but noticeable. He sat back down, suddenly very interested in his lunch tray. Mike turned to Lyra, who was glowing brighter than he'd ever seen, her hair crystals chiming a soft, happy melody. Ready to show us how to grow those crystals properly? He asked with a smile. For the first time since she'd arrived at the school, Lyra's answering smile lit up the entire room. The old science lab had become a hub of activity over the next few weeks. After classes, students gathered there to watch Lyra work her crystal growing magic. Today, the lab was especially crowded as she prepared to demonstrate a special technique. The crystals respond to sound, Lyra explained, her voice stronger now that she was speaking about something she loved. Her skin glowed with confidence as she held up a seed crystal. On my world, we would sing to them as they grew. Each family had their own special songs. The students watched in amazement as she placed the seed in a special solution and began to hum. The liquid started to shimmer, and slowly, incredibly, the crystal began to grow and branch out like a tiny, glowing tree. That's amazing, said Rita, who had become one of the most regular visitors to these sessions. Her earlier cruelty had been replaced by genuine fascination. Can we try? Lyra nodded, smiling. Different voices create different patterns. Would you like to see? Soon, the lab was filled with students humming and singing to their crystals. Some grew straight and tall, others twisted into spiral patterns, each one unique to the voice that helped create it. Mike watched from his usual spot by the door, smiling at how things had changed. The school's upcoming cultural exchange festival had been his idea, but Lyra had transformed it into something much bigger than he'd imagined. In another corner of the lab, Lyra was teaching a group about bioluminescent art, something her people had perfected over thousands of years. Her own skin glowed with complex patterns as she demonstrated how emotions could be expressed through light and color. In my culture, she explained, creating swirling patterns of blue and gold across her arms, this would mean joy and gratitude. The patterns danced and shifted, drawing gasps of appreciation from her audience. Even Tom had found his way to the lab, though he tried to act like he wasn't that interested. Mike had caught him several times staring in wonder at the crystal formations, especially when Lyra explained how they could be used for sustainable energy, something that had helped his own family's moon colony years ago. The preparations for the festival were bringing out talents nobody had known about before. Students from other refugee families began sharing their own cultural traditions. A group of Centaurian students demonstrated their gravitational dance, floating gracefully through the air. Martian colonists shared their techniques for growing plants in harsh conditions. But it was Lyra's crystal forest that remained the centerpiece. She had been working on it for weeks, this time with help and protection from her classmates. It was twice as large as her original project, with contributions from everyone who had learned to grow crystals under her guidance. "Watch this," she said one afternoon, gathering everyone around. She touched one of the larger crystals and began to sing in her native language. The entire forest lit up in response, each crystal giving off a different note, creating a harmony that filled the lab with otherworldly music. "It's a story," she explained when she finished, "about leaving home, finding friends, and building something new." Her eyes met Mike's across the room. "About how sometimes, when you lose something precious, you can find something equally precious in its place." The room was quiet for a moment, everyone absorbing the beauty of what they'd just witnessed. Then someone started clapping, and soon the whole lab was filled with applause. As students began to pack up for the day, Mike noticed something remarkable. The groups weren't divided by species anymore. Humans chatted with Centaurians about crystal harmonics, while Martian students compared notes with others about light patterns. Lyra moved among them all, her skin glowing with happy patterns, her hair crystals chiming joyfully. "You know," Rita said, approaching Mike as he watched, "I never thought I'd say this, but I was wrong about her. About a lot of things." Mike nodded. "We all were. But that's the thing about humans. We can learn. We can change." "And sometimes," Lyra added, joining them with a smile that lit up her whole being, "we can help others change too." The crystal forest behind them hummed softly, its light reflecting off all their faces, making them glow as one. The Cultural Exchange Festival had changed everything at Central Space Academy. What started in the old science lab had spread throughout the entire school like ripples in a pond. Today, a month after the festival, those changes were more visible than ever. During lunch, the cafeteria tables were no longer divided by species. Humans sat next to Centaurians, sharing stories and jokes. Martian students taught others their traditional food preservation techniques, and at what used to be the popular table, Lyra sat surrounded by friends, her skin glowing with happy patterns as she helped Rita understand the basics of bioluminescent communication. "No, like this," Lyra laughed, showing Rita how to use the special light-reactive paint they'd developed together in science class. Rita's arm lit up with wobbly patterns that were supposed to mean friendship, but actually translated closer to hungry umbrella. "I'll never get this right," Rita sighed, but she was smiling. The mean girl who had once mocked Lyra's glow was now one of her most dedicated students. Tom, surprisingly, had become the biggest supporter of the school's new crystal growing club. His knowledge of moon colony engineering combined with Lyra's crystal expertise had led to some interesting experiments in sustainable energy generation. "Hey, Lyra," he called from across the cafeteria. "The latest batch is ready for testing. Want to check it out after class?" Mike watched all this from his usual spot, amazed at how much could change in just a few weeks. The school felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a heavy cloud had lifted. Even the teachers had noticed the change. In interstellar biology, students now eagerly shared details about their species' unique characteristics. What had once been sources of mockery became points of fascination and learning. Lyra's crystal hair, once a target for bullies, had inspired a whole unit on bioluminescent evolution across different worlds. The biggest change, though, was in Lyra herself. Gone was the scared, quiet girl who tried to make herself invisible. In her place stood someone who literally glowed with confidence. Her crystal hair chimed melodiously as she walked the halls, and younger students would follow her around, asking questions about her world and culture. One afternoon, the principal called an assembly. The entire student body gathered in the main hall, where Lyra's rebuilt crystal forest now stood as a permanent display. Its gentle lights and sounds had become a familiar comfort to everyone. "As you all know," the principal began, "our school was chosen to host next year's Intergalactic Youth Conference. We needed to select a student representative to present our school's approach to cultural integration. The committee has made their choice." Mike saw Lyra's skin flicker with surprise when her name was called. As she walked to the stage, her crystal hair creating a symphony of soft chimes, the applause was deafening. "This is more than just an honor for me," Lyra said, her voice clear and strong. "A few months ago, I was afraid to even speak in class. I thought being different meant being alone." She looked at Mike, then at Rita and Tom. "But someone showed me that being different isn't a weakness, it's a gift. And when we share our gifts with each other, we all become stronger." The crystal forest behind her responded to her emotions, lighting up in waves of blue and gold. Other students with bioluminescent abilities joined in, creating a stunning light show that rippled through the hall. After the assembly, a group of new refugee students approached Lyra. They had just arrived from another struggling colony, looking as scared and lost as she had once been. Would you show us how to fit in here?" one of them asked nervously. Lyra smiled, her skin glowing with warm, welcoming patterns. "I'll show you something better," she said. "I'll show you how to be yourself." Mike caught her eye across the hall and grinned. The scared alien girl who had once hidden in corners now stood tall, helping others find their way. Sometimes, he realized, standing up for someone doesn't just change their life. It starts a chain reaction that changes everything. Behind them, the crystal forest hummed its agreement, its light touching everyone equally, making them all glow as one. The graduation ceremony at Central Space Academy was unlike any before it. The main hall glowed with the light of 1,000 crystals, each one grown by students who had learned from Lyra over the past year. The traditional graduation robes had been modified to include bioluminescent patterns, a tribute to how much things had changed. Mike sat among his classmates, watching as student representatives from different species took turns addressing the crowd. The hall was packed with families from across the galaxy: humans, Centaurians, Martians, and dozens of other species, all together to celebrate their children's achievements. When Lyra took the stage as valedictorian, her crystal hair created music with every step. Her skin glowed with complex patterns that told a story of growth, friendship, and triumph. The crystal forest behind her, now a permanent fixture of the school, responded to her presence, filling the hall with soft light and gentle harmonies. "A year ago," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I was a refugee who had lost her home. I thought I would never belong anywhere again." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "But I learned something important here, something that humans taught me. Home isn't just a place. It's the people who stand beside you, who help you grow, who light up your darkest days." The patterns on her skin shifted to show waves of gratitude as she continued. This school taught me that being different isn't a weakness, it's a strength. And when we share our differences, we create something beautiful. As if on cue, the crystal forest behind her burst into a symphony of light and sound. Students throughout the hall activated their bioluminescent graduation robes, creating waves of light that moved through the crowd like a living aurora. "Look around," Lyra said, gesturing to the display. "This is what happens when we stop seeing each other as aliens or humans or refugees. This is what happens when we start seeing each other as friends." In the audience, Mike noticed Tom wiping away a tear, trying to pretend something had gotten in his eye. Rita, sitting nearby, was openly crying, her graduation robe glowing with patterns Lyra had taught her, patterns that meant pride and friendship. After the ceremony, as families mingled in the courtyard, Mike found Lyra standing by her crystal forest. She was showing a group of younger students how to sing to the crystals, teaching them the songs of her people. "Ready for the big move?" he asked, joining her. Lyra nodded. They had both been accepted to the Intergalactic University, where they planned to study xenobiology and cultural integration. The program they had started at Central Space Academy was being adopted by schools across Earth and other worlds. "You know," she said, touching one of the crystals gently, "when my family fled our dying world, we thought we were just running away. We never imagined we might find something better." A small group of new refugee students watched from nearby, their eyes full of hope. They wore the special welcome badges that Lyra had designed. Badges that glowed with encouraging patterns and helped new students find friends and helpers throughout the school. "The thing about humans," Mike said, smiling at the group, "is that we're pretty good at fixing our mistakes. Maybe not always right away, but we learn. We grow." "Like crystals," Lyra added, her skin glowing with happy patterns. As the sun set, casting long shadows through the crystal forest, the graduating class gathered for one last photo. Humans stood next to aliens, former bullies next to former victims, all wearing robes that glowed with friendship patterns. The crystal forest played its harmony, a song of home and belonging that needed no translation. Above them, the stars were coming out, the same stars that had once seemed so cold and distant to a scared refugee girl. Now they sparkled with promise, each one a potential new beginning, a new chance to spread the light of understanding across the galaxy. In the photo taken that day, which would hang in the school's hall for years to come, everyone was glowing. And if you looked closely, you couldn't tell who was human and who was alien anymore. They were just people standing together, their light outshining the darkness of prejudice and fear. That was their legacy, not just to their school, but to all the worlds among those distant stars.